Washington is a town of proudly practical men and women of action, and sometimes the action gets severed from thought. Charles was a reflective person in a not very reflective town.
I'm not suffering from any derangement syndrome having to do with the Beltway. I'm just trapped, unfortunately, in reality. And all of us are, and in the end, reality wins.
Charles was a thinker. He was deep.
He had the greatest of all temperaments for a columnist, which was he was a person of complete intellectual integrity.
I got off the Trump train on the day he announced for the presidency. I heard him say Mexican rapist, and I went ballistic. But I took the view that when he was sworn in, if you love your country, you gotta hope it succeeds. And success means that the president succeeds.
I was publisher of the Washington Post in 1984, and I used to have breakfast every Thursday morning with Meg Greenfield, a remarkable person who was the editorial page editor of the Washington Post for 25 years or so. And Meg was always looking for young people with strong political opinions on both sides who could write. It was Meg who found George Will as a columnist.
I think I first met Charles in the early 80s, maybe 1984. He wrote a cover story for the New Republic about me, calling me the best 18th century mind in America or something of the sort. And I invited Charles to lunch at a little fish restaurant on Upper Connecticut Avenue and was thunderstruck when he came in his motorized wheelchair, because I had no inkling, he never having given anyone an inkling, that he was a paraplegic.
So Meg started talking to me in 1984 about Charles Krauthammer and said that she thought what he'd been writing in the New Republic was amazing.
Back then, there weren't that many weekly columnists. The syndications generally told you you had to write twice a week. Charles said, well, I think really having one idea a week is the most you can expect of any columnist, and he proved them wrong. Hundreds of newspapers did subscribe to Charles.
After a while, I think people actually took for granted what Charles did.
At age 22, Charles returned from Oxford to go to Harvard Medical School. He had a diving accident. When taken to the hospital immediately, he left behind at the swimming pool 2 books. One was on spinal cords, and the other was a novel by Andre Malraux, Man's Fate.
Suddenly, this brilliant young man was faced with something life-shattering. He could no longer use his legs, he could no longer use his hands as he had before.
Charles, with the help of good friends at Harvard Medical School, was able to complete his studies. No small achievement, laying on your stomach for months on end.
It is a testimony to how smart he was, but above all, how strong he was. He changed his life expectations several times. First becoming a psychiatrist, then becoming somebody involved in politics and in a political campaign, and then, of all things, becoming a writer, and such a great one. He had to learn how to form his thoughts and then how to get them down just as he wanted.
I guess as editor, I knew him often through the eyes of the copy desk. So that vision of Charles was a little bit scary. He really didn't like having his copy changed, and he cared about every word, and he cared about his headlines.
It's hard to overstate the impact of Charles's column over the years. He made the case for a lot of the policies he favored and a lot of the issues he cared about much more cogently and much more strongly than the policymakers arguing for the same policies.
Charles was a neoconservative, a leading neoconservative, much more confident and ambitious than I was about America's efforts to spread democracy and freedom around the world.
And Charles was always a good, strong writer, but he made his reputation off of Barack Obama. When Obama was reelected, Charles said, "Oh, great. I got another good 4 years to go. He didn't just criticize Obama. He did it with a flair. And I could have to say, that was a good point, Charles. You scored well. I don't agree with it, but that was a hell of a good point you just made. And he'd had that little, gleam in his eye.
What people do not know about Charles, partly because he had a kind of sober mien, is that he was very amusing and amusable.
I'm Charles Krauthammer, responding to my mail. Some of it very nice, some of it very not nice. And this is Louise Butler. Krauthammer continues to prove that smart is the new sexy. Now, this is the kind of mail I like.
Charles loved his family and doted on his son. Danny Krauthammer made him and Robin just impossibly happy from the beginning. Charles was always glad to see people, always posed certain impossible challenges. I would be excited about some biography I'd read, and Charles would hand me a book on quantum physics. So many of our conversations over the years were about baseball.
Charles and I mostly talked about baseball. You get your fill of talking about politics.
When I heard he was ill was the first time his column disappeared.
He went in for surgery 10 months ago. In his usual understated way, he said to me, wouldn't be that big a deal for a lot of people, but I'm not a good surgical candidate.
But it hit me so hard when he disclosed the situation. This is somebody too special to lose.
Reading back through some of his columns and his book, I came across this wonderful thing he wrote about the Voyager 1 and 2 that we sent out. And he said, what did we pick to try and show alien life, that there was intelligent life on Earth? We could have picked Bach, we could have picked all kinds of things. What did we pick? The speeches of a UN Secretary General who, as Charles said, turned out to be a Nazi. He said, it makes you want to think, send out Voyager 3, recall previous message. And I started thinking, well, we ought to just send one out with some of Charles's columns, and that would show that there's intelligent life on Earth. So he's left us with a lot of great columns that we can enjoy. I feel like the Friday page will always be missing something.